There's a kind of silence that does not mean peace. In Umuoha, the villagers knew this silence well. It arrived every night at the same hour, that suspended, breathless moment just before midnight when the crickets stopped, when the frogs along the stream held their throats, when even the wind seemed to pull itself back from the trees as though it had remembered something terrible and chosen not to move. The elders called it Nzuzo, the hour of hidden things. Children were warned never to be outside during Nzuzo. Wives bolted their doors. Men who had to travel at night spat on the ground 3 times before the hour came and walked faster than their age allowed. Nobody spoke about why. Nobody needed to, because in Umuoha, everyone already knew. They knew about the black owl. They had all heard it, that low, resonant call that was not quite a bird and not quite a man, rolling out of the forest at midnight like something dredged from the bottom of a river. They had all seen it at one time or another, that enormous shadow crossing the moon, wings spread wide as a grown man's arms, eyes burning amber in the darkness like 2 dying coals. They knew it was not a natural thing. What they did not know, what nobody in Umuoha dared to say aloud, was where it went when the night was finished, what it returned to, what face it wore when the sun rose, and the village woke, and the morning fire was lit, and a man sat down to drink his palm, wine as though he had slept through the whole night like everyone else. They did not know, or perhaps they were only pretending not to. This is the story of what lived inside that pretending, and what happened the night it finally cracked open. The harmattan had come early that year. It arrived in Umuoha the way bad news always arrived, quietly without announcement, settling over the red earth like a thin skin of dust that coated the mango leaves and crept into the corners of every compound and made the old people cough in their sleep. The air tasted of dry iron. The sky turned the color of a faded wrapper, pale and stretched and tired. Okafor Dike did not mind the harmattan. He rose before the sun most mornings, the way he had done since he was a boy following his father to the palm groves. His body knew the hour without a cock's cry to announce it. He would sit outside his door in the courtyard on the low wooden stool that had belonged to his father and drink the first cup of palm wine from the calabash he kept beside his bed and watch the darkness slowly loosen its grip on the world. He was a large man, Okafor, broad through the chest and shoulders, with hands that looked as though they had been carved specifically for climbing, wide palms, fingers that gripped like iron clamps. His face was not unkind. It was the face of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, to keep the important things inside, where weather could not touch them. The village respected him the way they respected a well that never ran dry, without thinking much about it, drawing from it when they needed to, never asking what lay beneath. He had a wife, Adora. He had a son, Chibikum. He had a compound that sat at the eastern edge of the village, close enough to the forest that the trees cast long shadows across his rooftop in the afternoon. Everyone in Umuoha agreed. Okafor Dike was a good man. A quiet man, yes. A man who smiled rarely and laughed even more rarely. A man whose eyes sometimes went somewhere distant and stayed there longer than was comfortable. But a good man. A steady man. A man you could trust. They said these things about him with the particular confidence of people who had never been given a reason to say anything else. Adora Dike had been given a reason. She had been given several. The first time she noticed, she told herself it was nothing. She had woken in the deep middle of the night. She never knew what woke her, only that something did, and reached across the mat for her husband's warmth and found the space beside her flat and cold. She lay still for a moment, listening. The compound was quiet. The courtyard was empty. The door was shut. She had gone back to sleep. The second time, she did not go back to sleep. She lay on the mat with her eyes open in the darkness, her hands still pressed flat against the cold space where Okafor should have been, and she listened. She heard the forest, the trees moving in a wind she could not feel through the walls. And beneath the trees, faintly, that call, low and rolling and enormous, settling in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She pulled the wrapper tighter around herself and said nothing. By the third time, she had begun to count. She kept a small mark on the back of the door, a thin line scratched into the wood with her thumbnail, low enough that Okafor would not see it when he swung the door open. 1 mark, 2, 3, 4. Every mark was a night she had lain alone and listened to that sound from the forest. Every mark was a morning she had watched her husband come to breakfast and say nothing, eat his food, drink his palm wine, speak to her in his normal measured way about normal measured things, the price of palm oil, the state of the road to Eek Market, whether Chibikum was studying what he was supposed to study. She had 12 marks on the back of that door before she finally said something. She chose a Sunday afternoon, when Chibikum was at his friend's compound and the courtyard was quiet and the harmattan light came through the window at a low, honest angle that made it hard to hide in. She said, "Okafor, where do you go at night?" He was repairing a length of rope, working it through his fingers in smooth, practiced loops. He did not stop. He did not look up. He said, "I sleep at night in camp. You know this." She watched him. He continued with the rope. She said, "The mat is cold when I wake. The door is shut, but you are not there." Now he looked up. His face was exactly what it always was, composed, careful, giving nothing away. He looked at her the way a deep well looks at the sky, showing you the reflection, showing you nothing of the depth. He said, "You were dreaming." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she turned and went back to the kitchen. She did not scratch another mark on the door. Instead, she went to see Ezenwanyi Agida. Ezenwanyi lived where the path to the stream bent sharply left and the trees grew so close together that the afternoon sun could not get through. Her compound was small and dense, herbs hanging from the eaves, pots arranged in patterns that meant something to people who knew how to read them, a fire that seemed never to go completely out. She was old in the way that certain trees were old, not declining, only deepened, her roots going further down with every year, her bark harder, her shade cooler and more permanent. She listened to Adora the way she listened to everything, with her eyes half closed and her hands folded in her lap, and a stillness about her that made the air around her feel slower, thicker, as though time moved differently in her presence. When Adora finished, Ezenwanyi said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "How long?" Adora said, 12 nights that I am certain of, perhaps more before I began to count. Ezenwanyi unfolded her hands. She looked at them as though she were reading something written in her own palms. Then she looked up at Adora with eyes that had been watching Umuoha since before Adora's mother was born. She said, "Go home. Lock your door. Do not look out the window at midnight. And when your husband returns, and he will return, do not ask him where he has been." Adora said, "That is all." Ezenwanyi said, "That is everything." Adora walked home through the harmattan afternoon with the taste of iron in her mouth and 12 marks on the back of her door, and the particular terror of a woman who has just been told, without being told, that everything she feared was true. Chibikum Dike was 17 years old and in possession of 2 dangerous qualities, intelligence and restlessness. In a different era, in a different place, these qualities might have made him a scholar or a general. In Umuoha, in the grip of a dry harmattan season, they made him a boy who could not leave things alone. He had noticed his father the way a sharp-eyed boy notices everything, obliquely, sideways, storing observations he did not yet know the use of. The way his father sometimes paused mid-conversation and looked toward the forest with an expression that belonged to no language Chibikum knew. The way his father's hands, those enormous tapper's hands, sometimes trembled very slightly in the mornings. Not from cold, not from age, but from something else, something interior, something being suppressed with great effort. He had noticed his mother's silence. He had noticed the marks on the back of the door. He had noticed everything and said nothing, because he was his father's son, and his father's son had learned early that the most dangerous things were the things kept inside. But then Chikwindu came to him. Chikwindu was 22, a night farmer who worked a small plot beyond the eastern edge of the village, past the compound of the Dike family, past the place where the path narrowed and the trees began to crowd. He was not an imaginative young man. He was practical and direct and not given to stories, which was exactly why Chibikum believed him. Chikwindu sat across from Chibikum in the shade of the mango tree behind the school and spoke in a voice pitched low and steady, the voice of a man reporting facts. He said, 3 nights ago, I was coming home from the farm at midnight. I had stayed late because of the yam mounds. I was passing your father's compound, and I saw. He stopped. Chibikum waited. Chikwindu said, I saw your father standing in the courtyard. He was standing very still, facing the forest. And then, Chibikum, I swear on my father's grave, I swear on my 2 eyes, the air around him went dark, like a shadow folded over him from above. And then there was no man. There was a bird, a black bird, enormous, larger than any bird I've seen in my life. It spread its wings and rose straight up and went into the trees. The harmattan wind moved through the mango branches above them. Chibikum sat very still. He said, and you told no one? Chikwinda said, I am telling you. After Chikwinda left, Chibikum sat under the tree for a long time. He turned the information over in his mind the way you turn a strange stone in your hands, looking for the angle that makes it make sense. He thought about the marks on the door. He thought about his mother's new silence. He thought about his father's eyes going distant toward the forest, those trembling hands in the morning, the way the whole compound felt different at night. Held, waiting, not entirely safe. He made a decision. He would stay awake that night. He would watch. That night, Chibikum lay on his mat fully dressed with his eyes open, listening to the compound settle around him. He heard his mother's breathing slow and deepen. He heard the village outside lose itself to sleep. The last conversations dying, the last fires banking down, the last footsteps retreating into compounds. He heard the crickets and the frogs and the distant murmur of the stream. And then, at the hour when all of it stopped, when the silence arrived the way it always arrived, sudden and total and wrong, he heard his father get up. He counted to 30. Then he went to the window. The courtyard was pale under a half moon, the harmattan dust catching the light and giving everything a thin silver coating. His father stood in the center of the courtyard with his back to the house, facing the tree line. Chibikum gripped the window frame. He watched. Okafor Dike stood motionless for so long that Chibikum began to believe he had imagined the movement, that his father had simply been standing there all along, that this was something innocent, that there was an explanation, that the darkness came, not from above, as Chikwindu had described, from within, from Okafor himself, a darkness that bloomed outward from his skin the way ink blooms in water, spreading and thickening and consuming his outline, his shape, the familiar broad silhouette of the man Chibikum had known every day of his life. The air around him seemed to fold. The moonlight bent away. And then there was a bird, black, enormous, utterly silent. It stood where his father had stood for 1 full second. And Chibikum saw the eyes, amber and burning and terribly, unmistakably awake. And then it opened its wings and rose without a sound into the sky and disappeared over the tree line. Chibikum stood at the window for a long time after. He was 17 years old, and he was his father's son, and he did not cry. But his hands, on the window frame, were shaking. If this story is gripping you the way I think it is, stop for 1 second and subscribe. Hit the bell, because what happens next in that forest is the part nobody in Umuoha was ever supposed to know. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Nwosu Iziga heard about the owl the way he heard about everything in Umuoha, through the gap between what people said and what they meant. He had been drinking with 3 other men behind Ogwefai and Wachuku's compound when Chikwindu, who had now told his secret to 1 person too many, let slip in pieces across 2 cups of palm wine. Nwosu had not said a word. He had simply listened and nodded and refilled his cup and filed everything away behind his easy, uncomplicated face. The next morning, he went to Agui Obi China. The Agui listened with the expression of a man being told something he would prefer not to have been told. He sat behind his low table in the reception room of his compound, a room that smelled of tobacco and old authority. And he tapped his fingers against the table and looked at Nwosu with the careful eyes of a man calculating weight. He said, "You are sure of your source?" Nwosu said, "Chikwindu is not a man who invents things." The Agui tapped the table again. He said, "Okafor Dike is a peaceful man, a contributing man. He has never caused trouble in this village." Nwosu said, "That is what makes it worse, is it not?" The Igwe dismissed him with a wave and spent the rest of the morning sitting very still, thinking. By afternoon, he called the elders. By evening, Umuoha was burning quietly with the particular fever of a secret that had stopped being a secret, moving from compound to compound in lowered voices, reaching women at their cooking fires, reaching children who were supposed to be asleep, reaching everyone with the speed and efficiency of the thing that villages do best, which is know things they're not supposed to know and then pretend they do not know them until the moment arrives when pretending becomes impossible. Adora felt it before she could name it. A change in the texture of the greetings she received at the market. A certain careful warmth from women who were usually careless. The way conversation turned slightly when she arrived and turned back slightly when she left. The way people's eyes moved to her husband's compound as they walked past and then moved away too quickly. She came home and sat in the kitchen and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. Then she heard Chibikim come in. She heard him stand in the kitchen doorway. She said, without turning, "Whatever you saw, you will not speak of it outside this compound." A long silence. Chibikim said, "You already knew." She said, "I have always known." He came and sat across from her. In the low afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, he looked, for a moment, like a smaller version of his father, the same set to his jaw, the same quality of holding things inside. He said, "How long?" She said, "Long enough." He said, "Mama, what is he?" She looked at her son, this boy she had carried, this boy she had fed and protected and shaped with her own hands, and she said, "He is your father. That is what he is." It was the truest thing she knew. It was also not nearly enough. Okafor knew the village had shifted before anyone came to him directly. He had a hunter's sensitivity to atmosphere, to the quality of silence, to the way the air changed when danger was present. He felt it on his skin walking to the palm grove. He felt it in the way the morning greetings came, slightly too careful, slightly too correct, the way people are correct with someone they have decided they are afraid of. He came home that evening and sat in the courtyard and drank his palm wine and let the harmattan evening come down around him and thought about everything he had spent years not thinking about. He had been 17 the first time it happened. He had been walking home from a night errand for his father. A message carried to a compound on the far side of the village, and he had stopped to urinate at the base of a great ogilisci tree. And the tree had spoken, not in words, in something older than words, something that entered through the chest rather than the ears. A vibration, a knowledge, a transfer of something from the tree into his blood that he had no language for then and still had no language for now. He had stood at the base of that tree for a long time afterward, feeling himself different, feeling something in him that had not been there before, a heaviness, a power, a darkness not malignant but enormous, like carrying a second sky inside your ribs. The first transformation had terrified him. By the 10th, he had stopped fighting it. By the 20th, he had understood something essential. It came at midnight, and it left at dawn, and the forest was where it needed to go, and when it returned, it brought him back whole, back human, back to his wife and his son and his palm trees and his ordinary life. And as long as nobody knew, as long as nobody was harmed, as long as the secret stayed inside the Ogain Nzuzo where it belonged. He had told himself this for 20 years. He was sitting in his courtyard drinking palm wine when Nwosu Izigu came through the compound gate with the specific face of a man arriving as a friend and leaving as a messenger. Okafor watched him come. He said, "Sit down, Nwosu." Nwosu sat. He accepted palm wine. He drank half of it. He put the cup down. He said, "The Igwe wants to see you tomorrow." Okafor said, "I know." Nwosu looked at him. For a moment, just a moment, the messenger dropped away, and the friend came back, the friend from 40 years of shared childhood, of climbing the same trees, and swimming the same streams, and growing into men on the same red earth. Nwosu said, very quietly, "Okafor, what are you?" And Okafor looked at his oldest friend across the courtyard of his father's compound, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your friend?" "Still, whatever else." Nwosu left. Okafor sat alone until the sun finished setting. Inside, Chibikum had been watching his father through the window the whole time. When the courtyard was empty, he went to his mother and said, "He knows they know." Adora said, "Yes." Chibikum said, "What does he do now?" Adora looked at her son. She looked at the door, the back of it, where the marks were 12 thin lines scratched low in the wood, her private record of a secret she had carried alone. She said, "He goes to see Ezenwanyi. He has always known, in the back of his knowing, that it ends with her. Every path in Umuoha ends with her." Chibikum said, "You sent him?" She said, "I did not send him. I made it so there was nowhere else to go." Her son looked at her for a long time. He said, "You knew it would come to this." She said, "I am his wife. I have always known everything and said nothing and waited. That is its own kind of power." Okafor went to Ezenwanyi at dawn. He had not slept. He had returned from the forest to the first thinning of the dark, earlier than usual, as though the thing inside him understood what day was coming and had released him gently. The way you release something you know is going back to face its reckoning. He walked the path to the stream bend with the harmattan dust rising around his feet and the village still sleeping on either side and the trees ahead of him drawing together in the pre-dawn dimness. He walked like a man walking towards something inevitable. Not slowly, not reluctantly, but with the measured pace of someone who has decided. Ezenwanyi was already awake. Of course she was. She was sitting outside her door with her fire going and a pot of something on it and her hands in her lap, and when Okafor came through her gate, she looked at him the way she had looked at Adora, half-closed eyes, total stillness, reading the full text of him before he had spoken a word. He sat across from her without being invited. He said, "You know what I carry?" She said, "I have known since you were 17 years old, and you stopped at the Ojilisai tree on the Nkwo Road." The harmattan morning moved around them. The fire crackled. Okafor said, "Then you know it was not chosen." Ezenwanyi said, "Nothing that comes from that tree is chosen. It chooses." Okafor said, "Can it be undone?" A long silence. Ezenwanyi looked at the fire. She looked at the trees. She looked back at him. She said, "Everything can be undone. The question is never whether. The question is always, what does the undoing cost?" Okafor said, "Tell me." She told him. The fire crackled. The harmattan birds began their morning noise in the trees above. And Okafor sat and listened, and his face did not change. That deep, carved-containing face, but something behind his eyes moved. Shifted, the way a deep well shifts when something large drops into it. When she finished, he sat for another long moment. Then he said, "My son must not be told." Ezenwanyi said, "Your son already knows more than you have told him." Okafor said, "My son must not be told what you have just told me." Ezenwanyi looked at him. She said, "That is the one thing in this that is yours to decide." He rose. He straightened to his full height. In the low dawn light, he looked exactly like what he was, a man in his 43rd year who had carried an impossible thing for 26 years and had arrived at the morning where the carrying stopped. He said, "Thank you, Ezenwanyi." She said nothing. He walked home. He met with the Igwe that morning. The meeting was held in the Igwe's reception room with 4 elders present. Old men with serious faces who had seen many things in Umuoha and were uncertain whether they had seen this. Nwosu was not there. Okafor understood this and was grateful for it. The Igwe said, "The matter before us is a matter for truth. We do not come with judgment. We come with questions." Okafor said, "Ask them." The Igwe asked. Okafor answered, "Not all of it. Enough." He told them about the Ojilisai tree. He told them about the transformation, what it was not, what harm it had never done, what nights it had taken him into the forest and returned him whole and living. He told them 26 years in the voice he used for true things, level, direct, unadorned. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long time. One of the elders said, "The Ojilisai tree on the Nkwo Road was cut down 11 years ago." Okafor said, "Yes." The elders said, "And yet it continues." Okafor said, "What is planted in a man does not need the tree to still be standing." Another silence. The Igwe said, "What do you propose?" Okafor said, "I have seen Ezenwanyi this morning. There's a way to end it. I have agreed to her terms. It will be done at the next midnight, the last midnight. After that, I'm only a man. The Igwe looked at him, looked at the elders. "Look back," he said. "And what are her terms?" Okafor said, "They are between Ezenwanyi and me." He went home and found Adora in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway the way Chibikum had stood, taking up the frame with his shoulders, the harmattan light behind him. She did not turn. She was grinding pepper, the stone moving in steady circles, her back straight and her hand sure. He said, "I'm going to end it." She said, "I know." He said, "Adora." She stopped grinding. She did not turn. He said, "I am sorry for every night you lay alone and listened and said nothing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I said nothing because I was your wife and not your enemy." Those are not the same silence. He crossed the kitchen and put his hand on her shoulder. Those enormous hands, the tapper's hands, gentle now, the way powerful things are gentle when they choose to be. She put her hand over his. They stayed like that for a moment, the two of them, in the kitchen that smelled of pepper and palm oil in 22 years. Then she said, "Come and eat." That night, Chibikum did not go to the window. He lay on his mat and listened to the compound and the village and the forest, and when the Oge Nzuzo came and everything went silent, he pressed his eyes shut and stayed still. He heard his father rise. He heard the courtyard. He heard nothing after that. No call from the forest, no sound of wings, no amber eyes burning in the dark. Only silence, the silence that does not mean peace, and then, slowly, a different silence. Lighter, emptier, the silence of something that has been put down. He lay still until dawn. When he came out, his father was sitting on the low wooden stool in the courtyard, the stool that had been his grandfather's, with a calabash of palm wine on the ground beside him and his hands folded in his lap, and his face turned toward the forest and his eyes open. Just a man. Only a man. Chibikum stood in the doorway. His father heard him and turned. His eyes were dark. No amber, just brown and deep and tired and present. He said, "Come, sit with me." Chibikum sat on the ground beside his father's stool the way he had sat as a small boy. The harmattan morning came up around them, pale and dusty and dry. The trees stood at the edge of the compound, ordinary trees, holding no darkness, offering nothing but shade. After a long time, Chibikum said, "Is it finished?" His father said, "Yes." Chibikum said, "What did it cost?" His father looked at the trees. He said, "Something I will not get back, but nothing you will lose." The boy sat with that for a while. He said, "Were you ever dangerous?" "To us." His father said, "No." A pause. Then, "Were you sure of that?" His father turned and looked at him. And for the first time in Chibikum's memory, the containing face broke open, just slightly, just enough, and what was underneath was not darkness and was not mystery. It was a man, exhausted, ordinary, guilty in the particular way that people are guilty when they have protected others by carrying something alone. He said, "Not always." That is the truth. Not always. The harmattan wind moved through the compound. The mango tree shifted. A bird, small, brown, unremarkable, landed on the fence post, looked at them both, and flew away. Chibikum nodded slowly. He reached over and picked up his father's calabash and drank from it without asking. His father said nothing. His father smiled. It was, as far as anyone in Umuoha could remember, the first time they had seen Okafor Dike smile in years. 3 days later, Ezenwanyi Agita was found at the base of the Ogilisite tree stump on the Nkwo Road, the ancient stump that had been sitting in the earth for 11 years since the tree was felled. She was seated upright with her hands in her lap and her eyes closed and her fire cold, and the herbs from her eaves piled neatly around her like an arrangement someone had made with great care. She was not breathing. She had not, by the look of it, been breathing since midnight. The village buried her at the forest edge where she had lived the way she would have wanted, with the proper rites and the proper mourning. The Igwe spoke. The elders poured libation. Okafor Dike stood at the back of the gathering with his wife on one side and his son on the other, and did not speak. He was the last one to drop earth on the grave. He stood over it for a long moment after everyone else had moved away. Nobody heard what he said. Nobody asked. In Umuoha, the Oge Nzuzo still came. The crickets still stopped. The frogs still held their throats. The wind still pulled itself back from the trees. But the call, that low, rolling, enormous sound from the forest, did not come anymore. The great shadow no longer crossed the moon. The amber eyes no longer burned in the dark above the Dike compound. Children were still warned not to go outside at midnight. Old habits do not die simply because the thing that made them dies. But slowly, quietly, over the months that followed, something shifted in Umuoha. A loosening. The village breathed differently, slept more fully. The women who bolted their doors still bolted them, but with less urgency, the way you lock a door out of custom rather than fear. Okafor Dike continued to rise before dawn, continued to sit on his father's stool and drink his first cup of palm wine and watch the darkness loosen. But his hands no longer trembled. His eyes no longer went to the forest. He drank his palm wine and watched the morning come and was, as far as anyone could see, as far as he himself could tell, only a man. His wife brought him food. His son sat beside him. The compound breathed. What Ezenwanyi had asked of him and what he had given in that transaction, what piece of himself had passed from him to her to the earth that now held her, this was never spoken of. Not by Okafor, not by Adora, who understood enough to know she did not need to know everything. Not by Chibikum, who had his father's instinct for keeping the important things inside, where weather could not touch them. Some things in Umuoha were left in the Oge Nzuzo. Some things were meant to stay hidden. The wise ones knew, you do not always need to understand a thing in order to survive it. You only need to know when to lock the door, and when finally to open it. If this story moved something in you tonight, if it sat in your chest the way Umuoha's silence sits, share it with someone who needs a story like this. Subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment below. Did Okafor do the right thing? Did Ezenwanyi know she was going to die? I want to read what you think. I'll see you in the next one.